Hi, and welcome to this Treehouse workshop. I'm Andrew Chalkley, the jQuery teacher. We've sourced some questions from our members, so let's get right to it. Aaron Daub says, how do you do math in jQuery? So I've rustled a quick example here together with a number on the left and a number on the right, and they've got IDs of right and left, and a result. So I've put some code, JavaScript code here down at the bottom to calculate when we click on this button. So I get the val of the left input text field and the val of the right input text field and add them together. And then I set the value of the result with the variable addition. So if we click on calculate, 1 plus 1 is 11. Well, it's not. So there's something going on here. What it's doing is it's getting the value of these fields as strings and not integers. So the quick fix to change a string into an integer is just multiply it by 1. So if we click on run now and then click on calculate, 1 plus 1 is 2. And just to prove that it does work with other numbers, 1 plus 2 is 3. So that's simple math. Now, there may be times where you want to do more complex math, such as use pi or sine or cosine. And JavaScript has its own math class where you can call a method. For example, to get the value of pi is the capital P and I. So in a very similar way to what I did before in the other calculate method is I've got the left value, and because pi is a number and we're multiplying it by a string, we should get the value of pi in the result box here. So you can click on pi, and as you can see, 3.14, that's about as far as I can go. But you can also, obviously, change it to 2 pi, which is 6.28. On to the next question. Gareth Redfern asked, what is the best way to practice and become better at jQuery and JavaScript? Well, first off, practice makes perfect. Keep experimenting with things and prodding and see what happens. So experience comes into it by just using it in your projects. I would say another good example is to have a look at CoffeeScript. CoffeeScript is a language that gets compiled down to JavaScript. For example, here you can see it's a lot shorter than writing out JavaScript, but it shows you some really cool best practices. For example, to declare all your variables at the top and declare functions as variables also, so you can pass those into other functions. So it really gives you an idea of what you can do with JavaScript, which you may not get in other sources. And depending on the scope of your project, you may want to encapsulate your code in a self-executing function. If you don't know what that is, we're going to see one very shortly. I'll have to apologize in advance if I pronounce your name wrong, but Spy Lefkaditis asked if I would take you through the process of making something. And I thought a good idea would be a jQuery plugin. So what we want to do is have a plugin that validates whether an email address is valid or not in a text field or a text area. What we need to do is go to the jQuery.com website and go to plugins and authoring. We see that there's some documentation on how to create your own plugin. So here, I'm just going to copy and paste this and take this over to a JavaScript file called valid email. And I'll paste that in there. And you can call this function, my plugin, whatever you want. What makes sense is valid email. So I'll do that first. And what we want to do next is just copy in some code that I prepared earlier. So remember when I was talking about the self-executing function? That is what this is here. So there's a function, an anonymous function, it's got no name, and it gets passed a variable that's in a set of parentheses, and this executes that function. This is ideal for scoping your variables and method names. So in this case, when we call this check function, it's only available within our plugin. So let's go over some of the content of this function here. What we want to do is check whether the field is an input or text area. Now is a jQuery method, so we check whether if it's an input or text area. And this will return true if the selected element is a input or text area. So if it is true, we want to check whether if it's a valid email. We'll be using a thing called a regular expression, which simply put checks expressions or strings whether if they conform to a certain format. And we call test on the regular expression with the field's value. Now if the selected element is not an input or text area, we're going to return false. So what we can do here is return check, and we can call this. Now this, in this context of valid email, is the element that we're selecting. So if we take a look at the HTML and the JavaScript that I prepared earlier, we've got two conditional statements here where we select a text area and check whether if it's a valid email, and we add the class of valid or remove the class of error. And if it's invalid, we remove the class valid and we add the class error. And the same here for the input. So if it returns true and it's valid, we should get green. So let's save our file there and jump back to our browser and hit refresh. And as you can see, it's invalid. But when we type in .com, it doesn't validate. So what we want to do is really extend this plugin so that it will validate on particular key events that are triggered. So let's go back to our JavaScript. And what we're going to do here is we're going to pass in the variable options. We want this to be backwardly compatible with the code that we've just done. So we're going to do options is equal to options, so if it's set, or an empty hash. Then we want to set some default values. So I've also prepared down here what kind of thing we're looking for. So we want to be able to pass in a key of on with the event, for example, key up. We want to pass in a success callback and a failure callback, whether if it validates or invalidates. So let's go back to here and set on is equal to options.on. We'll also set success to equal, oh, missed options there, options dot success. And if there isn't a function passed in, what we're going to do is just create an anonymous function. And then we'll have a failure too. Which is another anonymous function. And then what we want to do is apply whatever code has been entered by the plugin user. So let's create a new method down here called function apply user code. and we want to pass in a field as well. Now we want to check if the field is valid, and if it is valid, we want to call the success method. So we do success, call, and then we need to call get the first HTML element that jQuery returns. So when we pass in an object into the call method in JavaScript, this is a special JavaScript method, it passes that into the context what the user expects. So we're passing the field into this anonymous function here. So when we apply to this the valid or error classes, it will mean the input that the text event has happened on. And we also want to do the same for failure too. So I'm just gonna copy that and say failure. Cool. So next we want to actually apply this code if the on variable has been set in the options. So we do that by doing another conditional if type of on is string. So if type of on is string, this is where I prefer, because we're dealing with lots of different contexts here, is to set a variable at the top here, say of input, and just define it as this. So when I go back down here and do $input, we know what this is. So we've got input, and we can use the jQuery bind method, and we can pass in on. So if it's a key up, key down, focus or blur, we can bind that event handler to that input field. So we pass in an anonymous function, and then we want to call apply user code, and we want to pass in this. So where this is the element that has had this event handler bound to. So you can see how this can get confusing. And also on the input, we also want to go over each kind of that input and apply the check on those fields. So we do another anonymous function and apply user code. And once again, the context of what we're cycling over. So that should be it. So let's go back to our browser and refresh. And as you can see, it validates. So let's try it on key up. And when a valid email address is entered, it goes green. So that's it. Today we've learned how to do jQuery and maths. It's just JavaScript and maths. You manipulate strings into integers. We've also talked about best practices and what we can learn from things like CoffeeScript. And we've also created a plugin, which is great. So if you've really enjoyed this video, check out teamtreehouse.com. I've been Andrew Chalkley, and see you next time.